Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day, as always, throughout our live streams, if you feel so inclined, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. You can also do it through our website, gsmcpodcast.net as well. You can leave a tip or donation, or through the Super Chat. Leave a comment, question, or concern you have throughout the show, and I'll be glad to answer them on air. I love hearing from you all. It just makes this show that much better. But without further ado, let us jump into our second segment, talking about some fantasy stars of the weekend, first round playoff matchups, and these are the difference makers that I saw in these matchups. Now, a lot of these players, mind you, outside of a couple obvious superstars here, were kind of hidden gems throughout the season. They may not have been with you through your entire fantasy journey this year, but they certainly helped you get to this point, no matter where they came along. And so I wanted to be emblematic of that, because I feel like this season has been all about unlocking hidden gems at each and every position, because some positions have been better than others, some have been worse than we expected. So I want to be as fair and partial as possible to certain players. Impartial, so to speak. But ultimately, the potential final list of fantasy stars I compiled is a very special one, because there's so much hidden talent here. And I feel like a lot of you really loved this kind of advice and love hearing about how certain players have performed throughout this fantasy season. So without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting off with one of the best QBs in fantasy these past 5 years, and potentially in the running for his third MVP award. No matter what you think, I think that this game proved that this race isn't quite over yet here in the MVP race, but I do think that this player is making a great case for really running Josh Allen close in the voting. Lamar Jackson, 21 of 25, 290 yards, 5 touchdowns, 36.1 fantasy points. And yes, you can say with the Giants, yes, I was in that atmosphere, and I saw, as I was heading towards the stadium, the John Mara out flags, or John Mara has to fix this football team flag. So we know that this is a Giants team that is terrible that Lamar Jackson beat up on. But Lamar Jackson just proves that overall, you can't really count him out in terms of how you think about him. He can have these weird moments where the pass game and his dual threat ability don't often connect. He can have those moments, much like what Josh Allen had in his past. But I do feel like this season, Lamar Jackson has proven that he can be a Super Bowl caliber quarterback for the Ravens. And yes, they have a couple losses on their schedule that are questionable in terms of execution, in terms of decision making, that fall largely on Lamar Jackson as the quarterback of his football team. But when he's on, you can't deny that he's fantastic. 34 touchdowns to only 3 interceptions this season. That's unheard of in a race in which he's slowly lagging behind Josh Allen. And I feel like to count him out, whether it be in real life or in fantasy, is heretical at this point, because he's already proven what he can do in both regards. And sometimes people forget about it because they hold others up as well. And so that's why I really wanted to acknowledge Lamar Jackson here out of a bunch of different quarterbacks. But I also wanted to acknowledge a guy that's definitely not on your fantasy roster at this point in the season, and I hope not at this well. But he has certainly made a case to remain in the NFL, at least as a backup option. He has proven in these spot starts here for Jacksonville that he's competent and serviceable enough to potentially serve a football team next year in the National Football League. How about Mac Jones putting in a gutsy performance against the Jets? And I know it's the Jets as well, but this Jaguars team, from where it was when Trevor Lawrence went down to now, really is proven that they have heart, and they're still playing for Doug Peterson, even though he's out the door at the end of the season, in my opinion. 31 of 46, 294 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, one of which, was kind of a garbage time interception when they were trying to drive down the field. 18.66 fantasy points, though, and yes, I know that you guys are skeptical of why I put him on this list, but it's just a matter of looking ahead, because I always love to. And now, in a time where fantasy is winding down, it's never too late to think about all these players who were given a second opportunity, a second chance in their NFL careers, and Mac Jones was one who took it. He didn't necessarily have the longest of times to prove it, but I feel like in these small sample sizes we've seen of him, that he feels competent enough to really bolster an NFL team in transition. Maybe a team, say, like the Titans or potentially the Giants or Raiders, although they have high-end draft picks, might pick him up and use him as a bridge option. So potentially, if, say, you're thinking about what Sam Darnold is doing in Minnesota and say, hey, if Mac Jones gets picked up, he might have a career rejuvenation, much like Sam Darnold is having now, and I might use him next year. So that's what I'm trying to do here in one of my final Fantasy Star segments of the year, is try and highlight some players who are given this opportunity this season to start anew. And Mac Jones has proven that he was one of them, even in these small sample sizes we see out of him. Now let's get into the better guys, the guys who we know are superstars. This guy didn't necessarily prove this season he was a superstar. Yes, most of the season he was festering in Las Vegas, kind of creating the tension that arose there, and then ultimately leaving to enter some more tension with the New York Jets. And we didn't really think that, this guy could get going again, but if you still have him on his roster, you should be very thankful, even if you didn't start him, because this is still a guy who we know can work magic on Sundays in the NFL. Davante Adams, 9 receptions, 198 yards, 2 touchdowns, 42.8 fantasy points. It was as if he and Rodgers were back in Green Bay. And even, if it's a bad win for Jets fans, you have to relish those vintage Rodgers-Adams connections and how we were reminded of them this Sunday. And I feel like, the reason why Davante Adams could still be an asset in these final games of your fantasy season, whether you're in your consolation bracket or competing for a championship, is because of that connection. Now, I know that a lot of Jets fans or a lot of fantasy football owners might think I'm insane by saying that, but I do feel as if this connection is still something special while we still can see it, while we can still witness it. And I feel like, against the Bills and other divisional games to close out the season, they might not look as potent together, but this reminded us of what magic they were able to create, and potentially one more go-around if this could potentially be the end for both of them in New York. Maybe this connection, no matter how late it has come in the season, can bear some fruit for you in a fantasy perspective. But ultimately, even if it's just a one-off thing, we still have to respect Davante Adams for his status as one of the league's top receivers over these past couple of years. And then in terms of running backs, let's talk about that position, because this position has been one of the most difficult to assess all year long. I don't really know if there are any tiers in terms of running backs, because there are so many high-end guys right now, right? You have your Saquons, you have your Henrys, you have players of that caliber. And then you get into the middle tier and you think, well, a lot of these guys can prove to be high-end starters for me, but a lot of them are too inconsistent to really merit consideration week in, week out. So I don't really know how to balance this position. Well, I can tell you this much. This was one of the worst weeks for running backs from a fantasy standpoint, but if you're an owner of Rico Dowdle, you have to be happy with how he's progressed in the absence of Dak Prescott. I feel like, Rico Dowdle is someone this Cowboys organization should invest in, right? Because out of all these players in this organization, all these big money contracts coming up, Rico Dowdle's could prove to be the most vital in tying down future success for Dallas. Because let's be real here. I think a lot of what went wrong for Dallas this season stemmed from the contract conversations in the offseason between both Lamb and Dak Prescott. And so it kind of carried over into this season, kind of really set off a very tense season for Dallas because of the fact that they invested so much money into Dak and CD, and they had to ultimately, as a result, kind of build this team around them and kind of place them on the pedestal for Dallas. Whereas guys like Rico Dowdle, guys like Jake Ferguson, guys like Brandon Cooks, guys like Jalen Tolbert kind of fell to the wayside. But now, in his absence, they're playing a lot more freely, and this game for Rico Dowdle proved that he can be an integral piece to when Dak Prescott comes back, the success of whether or not the Cowboys actually can build something here with this guy and these big contract that they have. 25 carries, 149 yards, 14.9 fantasy points for him. I just wanted to highlight him. And then last but not least, I had to do it because I said that this guy was one of my favorite starts of the week. Last week in my favorite start segment on Friday, Terry McLaurin, I had to include him on this list. 7 receptions, 73 yards, 2 touchdowns. Could have had way more. Had a couple of drops on what could have been very circus-like catches, but 26.3 fantasy points. Not bad of a prediction from your guy here. But ultimately, I feel like this list of NFL fantasy stars is a comprehensive list in terms of who we already knew were superstars and were integral pieces of getting you where you are right now, or the hidden gems who are you looking for in terms of the long-term future, guys who can be starting anew in terms of career arcs, but ultimately was such an exciting, exhilarating ride, delivering my fantasy stars list to you week in, week out, and hopefully we get to do it again soon. But you know what you think about it in the comments below, because coming next, we do in my potential final positional rankings of the NFL season and fantasy season for that matter at the QB position. You don't want to miss it. We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube.